All right, y'all. We have the one and only Dean Michelle Alexandra in the house. So we'll go ahead and get started and I'll start some opening remarks. So for everyone that doesn't know, I'm Dr. Anansi Wilson. I'm the founding director for the Center for the Study of Black Life and the Law, an associate professor of law here at Mitchell Hamline. We're based in St. Paul, Minnesota. And, the Center for the Study of Black Law really exists to kind of think about and explore the kind of interrelated connection between Black life and the law. We're particularly interested in the ways in which the law orders and disorders Black living and dying. So the title for today's conversation is Furtive Blackness and the Afterlives of Slavery. Furtive Blackness is a concept I coined to kind of think about the ways in which the Black body itself exists both in and outside of law. Inside of law, insofar as being always already reachable by its disciplinary arms, but outside of law insofar as the fundamental rights that are guaranteed to us by the Constitution, as well as statutory protections, seem to be unable or unwilling to fully attach to the Black body, particularly when we want to be protected or garner some type of benefit from the state or those that act as agents of the state. For those of you who don't know as well, St. Paul, and particularly Minneapolis, is also the place where Dred Scott was held as a slave 160 years ago. And in that case, Dred Scott versus Sanford, we learned, right, that the Chief Justice tells us that the Black man has no rights, that the white man is bound to respect. And it should be noted that this case has never been formally overturned. And so years later, of course, we get the murder of George Floyd. And this is also important to think about in context of this conversation because George Floyd's great-great-grandfather, his land was actually stolen from him when he was living down south, which gave the impetus for this family to move up to this part of the country. So what happens, right, if this kind of land theft, if the kind of afterlives of slavery, if we're talking about it now, if this notion of furtive blackness was not in place, would George Floyd, right, and other countless unnamed folks be alive today? So that's the prompt I want us to begin with. And with that, I'll just give the introduction to the titles of our glorious panelists here, and I'll give them a moment to give some opening thoughts as well as introduce themselves further. So first we have my good sister, Angela Rose Myers, who is the former president of the Minneapolis NAACP, and she's also a social justice activist and researcher of all the things that matter to Black life. Next, we have the one and only Professor and Dean Jamilah Jefferson Jones. She's also a research professor, and she's Associate Dean for DEI in my home state at the University of Kansas School of Law, holding us down. My auntie, sister, cousin, Dean Michelle Alexandra, as the 14th Dean of Loyola University Chicago School of Law, and she's the author of Sexploitation, which is one of my favorite books, and if you've read some of my work, you'll see it quoted over and over and over again. Next, we have Professor Shirley Thompson, who is also an author of many things, but she's also the associate professor of American Studies and Black Studies and the associate chair of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And she was also on my dissertation committee. So if it wasn't for her, there wouldn't be no me here, y'all. Next, we have Dr. Frank Leon Roberts, who is a scholar activist and assistant professor of English and Black Studies at Amherst College. More importantly to me, they also are the co-founder of the National Black Justice Coalition, in addition to being the founder of the Black Lives Matter syllabus group. So if you've taken some of my classes, I've stolen some of their work. You see the name on the syllabus for good credit there. And with that, I just want to throw it back to the folks here. What are you thinking about in terms of this kind of connection between furtive blackness and the afterlives of slavery, but also the moment we find ourselves in, right? Whether we're talking about all the things that have happened in the Twin Cities or things that have happened in your state, we can think about the two brothers that were just expelled from the Tennessee legislature. We can also think about even the white trans sister who was expelled from censured in Montana the other day. All these murders that we could go on and on and on and talk about. What is going on in this moment, and how do we contextualize this current moment in Black life, wherever your locale may be or nationwide? Feel free to jump in.
So in one sense, there's nothing new under the sun, right? And so I don't find this moment to be singular, rather it's cyclical. And it's part of the same cycle that we have been caught in. And that cycle has its peaks and valleys. And I'm concerned that we are coming to one of the lower valleys in the cycle and need to be very cautious, need to stay woke and be ready to run, which is something that I have been thinking about personally. So from a scholarship standpoint, one of the things that I've been focusing on is this idea of space and place and who belongs where and how that is articulated to us. One of the ways in which my co-author, Dean Tajania Henderson, she's the dean of the graduate school at Rutgers and also on the law school faculty there. She and I looked at this spate of white people starting in, or those racialized as white, starting in April of 2018, calling the cops on Black folk for simply being in a space that they had the right to be in, right? And we noticed that they were really using the language of trespass and nuisance to bring about this threat of police violence to these Black bodies that they wanted removed from these spaces. And so we decided, well, let's look at the historical record. And this was something white folks started doing right after emancipation, as freed Black people started invading their spaces, right? Had the right to be in these same spaces. And so we found a number of cases that went on from the 1860s, late 1860s, early 1870s through present time. And they would show up every few years, every few cycles, right? We get them in the 1930s and 40s, and we would get it some more in the 50s and 60s. The courts always did slap them back, right? Saying, no, actually just being Black isn't a nuisance. Though the court would also say, we don't want to be around those people either. But Black people just being Blackness in itself isn't the nuisance. They have to be doing something. But the cycles keep coming back, right? Where there's still this pushback of, wait, though, but why are they in this space? Why are they in my space, right? So I think that we keep having the same cycles and we're stuck in the same cycle.
Yeah, so I love how you brought up this kind of notion of not necessarily the idea of being Black, right, is the problem, but actually it's the kind of the practice of being Black in public or private that the court is then managing. What are other people thinking?
Well, I wanted to jump in and continue the thread that Jamilah has started. If we connect that historically, the ugly laws that regulated poor Black bodies and non-conforming bodies came up right after the Civil War, when veterans were coming back into cities. And so in disability and civil rights, we trace that in my courses to show this kind of practice of making sure that Black bodies were seen as not just nuisance, but not deserving to be in public. And then it always conflated with being poor, right? So the sight of bodies historically in the United States for Black folks is always the unsightliness of being Black, being poor. And if you're a woman, you're worse. If you're queer, you belong under the jail. But for me, I know part of my role here, I think, is to put it in everyday life. There's so much wonderful work done in the criminal justice frame, and for me, I look at it as everyday struggle. I look at it as the impossibility of being as a person who is Black and layered with women presenting, but also non-conforming or gender fluid. So that's why in sexploitation, I try to connect the thread to all aspects of society, what it means to be in this life in the United States means that you are always told that you don't have a right to exist, and that you should be formed to conform to any categories, particularly even if you conform to the stereotypes of being Black. That puts you in a super box, because don't be Black and queer, don't be Black and gender fluid, don't be Black and unmarried, don't be Black, you know what I mean? You belong nowhere, even within the group that you're stereotyped in the mainstream. So to further, the post-slavery life means a constant struggle to just be a spirit and be free. So I think that's where we start. What it means to be free. And even though we can't resist, we have to, right? Because the legal construct forced us into this conversation about Blackness. and what it is to be us after slavery, we have to first start reframing it to say, I'm a person and I deserve to be defining myself, evolving, no matter what, in based on my terms and not yours. And what does it mean to do that as a person who is classified as Black in the United States? I'm still trying to figure it out, but it's an everyday thing. And I think that's the charge that people like Professor Wilson here helps us do with the new generation being bolder. But what it means to be a spirit who is free. And then we get to play with all these demarcation and categories that they say we belong to. But that question there.
So just sort of, please, Dr. Thompson, to you.
Oh, okay. Thank you, because I want to pick up, well, thank you, first of all, for organizing this and inviting me. I want to pick up on this, this moment that we've, sort of been talking about, this sort of magical moment, the moment of emancipation, where a lot of sort of legal, cultural, political alchemy happens, right? It's sort of this magical sort of process by which slavery, the logics of slavery, are transposed into the logics of freedom and the shaping of what freedom is going to mean. So I like to think about sort of the afterlives of slavery, or, sort of conversations about the afterlives of slavery, and Dr. Wilson's idea of furtive blackness as a way of tracking how the constituent aspects of slavery on a micro level persist over the fact of formal emancipation. And furtive blackness in particular shows us how these evolving legal structures and practices allow for the permanent violent domination of Black bodies as one of the key constituents of slavery, as a property right, of slaveholders persists into the future, and how the law helps to authorize then this racialized violence and scrutiny of Black life. So we can think about how slave laws sort of transpose themselves into a condition that, is formally called freedom, right? Although, kind of we have our own sort of thoughts about that. So if fugitivity is sort of flight from productivity, or the attempt to kind of move oneself beyond the reach of property status, then furtivity is the perceived anticipation of that flight. Detecting furtive movements under slavery requires an expert eye, a building up of expertise. It authorizes the surveillance of Black bodies, allows for the formulation of this expertise about how to read Black bodies, gestures, and thoughts. Really how to externalize presumptions about Black gesture and thought, and bake these presumptions into the law, right? So what I appreciate most about these articles is that furtivity, this notion of furtivity, gives us the ability to kind of analyze these struggles over Black lives at a really granular level, at the level of the police encounter. An encounter with a deputized, protected white citizen. And there we see not only the application and formulation of expert knowledge and power, but also how Black folks kind of push back against, these legally privileged presumptions about what, kind of their actions actually mean. So we get to sort of see how Black folks witness, testify, and act. It's a space for creativity, imagination, and refusal, a space for Black life and defiance of the law. And I'm thinking of Mickey B's protest at the end of your Black furtiveness article. As the Black queer woman who moves her body against the law to imagine a kind of different kind of freedom. So theorizing furtivity, as Dr. Wilson does, invites us to kind of it helps us discern among micro performances of freedom at the level of gesture, glance, inkling of a thought, right? To sort of tap into what Black folks know about freedom from their vantage point of being not quite free, right? So I want to kind of introduce another figure into the mix, though. If we think about how the Afterlives of Slavery names the transposition of the functions of slavery, the apparatus of slavery through the fact of freedom, we see how the white mob is able to kind of fulfill the function of administering the violent domination of Black bodies, right? And to develop the expertise about how to read Black bodies. The white mob, the police, the deputized white citizen. We see how the state kind of acquires the ability to make the laws that capitulate to the need to keep Black folks in their place, right? That spatially and socially contain Black folks and makes it impossible or criminal for them to move outside of those boundaries. But I want to sort of introduce this other subjectivity, that of the corporation, the kind of artificial person who emerges with renewed force in the wake of the Reconstruction Amendments and the 14th Amendment in particular, right? Because that's where the capital of slave racial capital begins to accumulate, or accumulates with the increasing force, actually, continues to accumulate. And thinking about emancipation, one of the key crises and part of the alchemy of this process is how to recoup the value of slave capital. The $3 billion, or like it's something like $118 billion in today's money that inhered in the bodies of Black people, not to mention, what they produced as labor, or the reproductive capacity of enslaved Black women, or the way in which these bodies are leveraged as capital to acquire other wealth. So you got all that wealth that's canceled out by the act of formal emancipation. So how do we recoup that wealth becomes one of the key crises. And the 14th Amendment actually introduces a kind of answer to that, a solution to that problem, in the construction of liberal subjecthood, possessive individualism, whereby Black folks can now freely contract themselves out to work on horrible terms that tie them back to the land in this cycle of indebtedness. And that's how we get this sort of indebted servitude, what Saidiya Hartman calls, kind of burdened freedom. So it's a really constricted notion of freedom that is able to be accessed by Black folks in this period because of the terms of citizenship that the 14th Amendment conveys. But I think even more importantly, what the 14th Amendment does is that it cancels out the value of slave bodies, but then creates a national debt through which that value is going to be recouped. So the fourth section of the 14th Amendment actually provides for the establishment of a national debt that, quote, shall not be questioned, right? So this is the backstop to that value. And the holders of that debt are going to be the Wall Street corporations, finance institutions, railroad companies, so on and so forth, that actually, kind of hold that debt, right? So that's where the wealth is going to accumulate. So the functions of mastery are actually spread out, and the laws that govern segregation, or that determine, how Black bodies are going to move around space, the violence that is required to kind of make those laws work, and the market sort of flows that are going to ensure that wealth is accumulated by kind of these newly constituted, kind of powerful entities, is how the afterlife of slavery, how some of these structures are going to kind of continue to persist, even in the name of freedom, right? And so what I think is interesting about that magical alchemical moment is that it actually it says it conveys freedom, but what it really sets up is a hierarchy of credit and debt relationships. And at the top of that relationship, you experience sort of freedom of movement and time that sort of goes really confidently into the future. And at the bottom of that relationship is where Black folks, newly indebted free citizens who are, kind of existing within this cycle of compounding debt, are really kind of like find themselves collapsing onto a kind of present where their past has been canceled out and disavowed, and their future is constantly foreclosed upon, right? And that's a kind of capture of a population in space as well as time. And so what I love about your notion of furtivity is that it is a micro, it gives us a way of achieving a sort of micro analysis of a captive population and charting very subtle movements in space and time that allow for us to kind of access, this urge to break out of these strictures.
Thank you for this thorough reading. For those that have not read the article, Dr. Thompson has given you the overlay. So thank you for this. You're giving me a lot to think about as well. I'm taking notes over here.
So just building on the insights already of my brilliant colleagues. First, I actually just want to back up and say thank you. It's such an honor and a blessing just to be in the presence of such revolutionary comrades and luminous co-conspirators. And so I just want to acknowledge Dr. T's extraordinary organizing acumen and intellectual generosity in bringing these voices to the table. It's a blessing to be in all of your presence. Building on the insights already so carefully laid out before us today, I mean, we know that one of the ways that white supremacy tends to operationalize itself or sustain itself historically is that it allows for a period of relatively brief progress followed by that swift and virulent backlash. And we already know that story. I mean, from a political organizing perspective, the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of the afterlives of slavery is not, of course, the actual institution of slavery itself, but rather the original political afterlife of slavery's abolition. And so we know that the original political afterlife of slavery's abolition, as has already been articulated, is the birth of the tradition of white legislative backlash, a tradition that very much connects us to our current political moment in very particular ways and haunts history, right? So we know this story. It began in the context of slavery's abolition, where we had all that happened in the post-Reconstruction moment. Then, of course, moving to the middle of the 20th century, we had the relative gains of the civil rights movement, followed by all of the backlash that took place in the form of the war on drugs, the birth of the Southern Strategy, the age of Nixon, the birth of mass incarceration. All of this is to say, the first thing that this phrase of the afterlives of slavery does for me is it allows us to situate ourselves as being in a kind of third post-Reconstruction, which is, of course, William Barber's argument in his book, The Third Reconstruction. What does it mean to be thinking about this moment as a kind of third nadir moment where it is not incidental that in the very moment, or coincidental, that in the very moment where you have working class, queer, Black folk, young folk rising up saying Black Lives Matter, that it is in that political context that we get the birth of the Make America Great Again movement. And so this idea of the cyclical backlash is, of course, ghosting all over this. But beyond that, I wanted to just say that for me, part of why I think the conversation about the afterlives of slavery and specifically the idea of furtive Blackness is important for racial justice organizers is that it allows us, or maybe even forces us, to think differently about some of the language that we use to mobilize the language that we use for our mobilizing efforts. What do I mean by that? I've often said that this phrase, Black Lives Matter, needs to be rethought. And I always say that with all due respect to the queer Black feminist labor that gave birth to that phrase. But one of the things that I think Dr. T is doing in their work on Furtive Blackness is saying that white supremacy has actually never had a problem affirming that Black Lives Matter, that's not the issue here. It's not a mattering discourse, right? When we revisit that language of the slave masters in the 19th century, it's clear that those people knew and were the first to affirm that Black Lives Matter, because we live in a country founded on the propertying of people. The mattering of Black people was central to the development of American capitalism. So they knew that Black Lives Matter. Today, the neoconservative Republicans on the right, the neoliberal Democrats on the left, they both are going to affirm that Black Lives Matter, because without those lives, our prison cells are going to remain empty. The question here then becomes, and Furtive Blackness gets us to this is about the relationship between Blackness and the human. What does it mean to live in a country where the very idea that Black people are human beings is still a relatively new concept in the West? And so something about Furtive Blackness reminds us that white supremacy is first and foremost founded on the assumption that Black life is not human life. And so this is not a question about how do we mobilize a mattering discourse. It's a question about how do we confront the legacy of that 3/5 compromise, the denial of Black life, the status of human life. And so for me, that's what I think sort of Furtive Blackness helps us to get to.
Etienne, jump in, and then we'll come over here to you, Angela.
Yeah, first, thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm definitely honored to be a part of this conversation. I'm intrigued about the concept of furtivity and fugivity as a lens to think about the broader American experience more generally, and not merely as language to think specifically about Black life. Because I think this moment we find ourselves in is, as others have described, a moment of crisis that is not new, but in some ways is endemic to the American project, which is to say white supremacy, and perhaps, it expresses a kind of Hegelian vision of human being, and that has its flaws, to be sure, but it expresses in some sense a white supremacist thesis, a Black oppositional antithesis, and then a convergence that is the crisis, that we find ourselves in, that happens time and time again, from Reconstruction to civil rights to the movement for Black lives. But fundamentally, the issue that we continue to fail to resolve is, what does it mean to be a citizen in the United States? And that's a question that was central to the Reconstruction Congress. When they were debating the passage of the 13th Amendment, what did citizenship demand of the United States government? And the concept of being in the wake of slavery, I think, suggests the way that discourse was framed around the concept of citizenship being something oppositional to Blackness, right? So the concept of Blackness is essential to the formation of the U.S. citizen. But also it's central to the idea of whiteness, right? And so you cannot have citizens who are racialized as white without citizens who are racialized as Black. And so in some sense, as Ralph Ellison said, we're all trapped somewhere in the mystery of hell. And in that regard, all Americans, those racialized as Black, those racialized as white, and those who find themselves, unfortunately, somewhere in between, are sort of running from and running toward something that might give them a sense of what it means to be human, right? The question that Dr. Roberts was suggesting is, what does it mean? And then I agree with, what does it mean for us to be human? And more specifically, there's a political economic dimension. Right? What does it mean to be human in a capitalist political economy? And to me, this is where we're really beginning to come to terms with the meaning of liberty. To me, I think liberty in a capitalist society requires sacrifice. And that's a conversation that we're increasingly beginning to have and trying to reckon with. You know, I'm reminded of the Black woman, Annie Grant, who died after working in a Tyson's meat packaging plant. And her story was on the New York Times. After telling her employer, I'm exhibiting signs of COVID, of sickness, and I need to take time off. And the employer said, no, you're required to work, right? And in fact, then President Trump came up and said, our food packagers, our essential workers, they are required to work, to sacrifice. And so there's a sense in which Black bodies and other marginalized populations have always been required to sacrifice to sustain human being in these United States. And our inability to reckon with what that means is a kind of fugivity and a kind of furtivity at the same, in the same sense, running from what it means to be American. And so I think that's the project of the third Reconstruction, trying to reconstruct humanity, reconstruct citizenship, and to reckon with what racialization means, what Blackness means, right? Beyond the question of what it means to be Black, the question of what it means to be, it is a crisis for all citizens in the United States that I think we're struggling to deal with.
I agree. And I would take it home to right now, although this conversation has been so amazing, and it makes me think about even like that moment of Plessy versus Ferguson and Cheryl Harris's In the Shadow of Plessy, kind of thinking about the value of white skin and how after slavery, the status of Black folk was in a precarious moment. So also the status of white folk, had to be, reconfigured and solidified, right? And when just in a direct response to your comments, Dr. Toussaint, is I think about Minneapolis right now on the corner of 38th and Chicago, which has been renamed George Floyd Square. Right. And for the last 3 years, activists have held this space down in almost like a fugitive democracy. So, they have these 24 demands that only 4 of them, 3 maybe, the other ones have kind of worked themselves out on some aspect, but not really. They have these 24 demands to the city of Minneapolis, to the county, the Hennepin County, and a lot of them are around this restructuring of citizenship, and how to create a space, a physical space where everyone enjoys human rights. It's an interesting idea too. If we keep bringing up space, we're on Dakota Anishinaabe land that was stolen, right? And so it's interesting also in this point that is 38th and Chicago is in between 4 major neighborhoods. 3 of them are some of the most diverse neighborhoods in Minneapolis. One of them, not so much. You got white folk on one side and a historically segregated neighborhood on the other side, right? And this is where, George Floyd was murdered. This is often also before George Floyd was murdered. This is where Mayan Burrell was claimed to be when he was incarcerated. And Mayan Burrell has since been released from jail. He's innocent of his crimes of shooting a 11-year-old in the 1990s, but that's where Amy Klobuchar claimed he was on 38th in Chicago, right outside of the Cup Foods, right? And now it's Unity Foods. But the group there is taking over this space to create a zone that says, let's put people over institutions. What does it mean to claim this space in a practice of valuing Black life, Native lives, of valuing transness, queerness, of valuing the people here? What does this look like? And almost, again, a fugitive democracy, because the city of Minneapolis does not want this place to exist. They've run military tanks through the space on multiple occasions. They have hired police officers, of course, to take down the space, but they even hired Black, security forces to take down the space. And so, the existence and the continuous existence of making sure there's medical care, there's food for folks, there's clothing, there is a little garden. It's not a little garden, it's a beautiful big garden that has food and nutritious food for folks there. So they're really tangling with how does the dismantling of the city's, lived exploitation of Black labor, how can we do that while also building a world of existence where Black folk, and not just Black folk in and of itself, just Black folk, but Black folk are working within a society, right, in a democracy where their citizenship, their human rights, their lives are valued. And of course, they're doing this under increased surveillance. That's my research. I do police surveillance research and police brutality research. And when you go to George Floyd Square, there's 4 assumptions. And one of the 4 assumptions is you should assume that you are being recorded because there are cameras on every sub block. You should assume that not everybody who is there for your liberation, but you should assume, right, these things. But then with those assumptions, the assumption that these folks are still, pushing and working towards some type of community care that is beyond those basic assumptions as well.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing with that too, in your last comment, is about this kind of Black access to a type of privacy, right? Which, as we know, under constitutional order, essentially to have a real kind of right to privacy, you must also have property. But how can you have privacy without property? How can you have property if you're rendered propertied, right? So I'm thinking with all of you in this, and I'm really interested in going back to a little bit of critical race theory, what Derek Bell was talking about in this notion of racism being endemic. If we take racism being endemic seriously, and maybe we don't, we can talk about that as well. Does that mean that the law itself is obsolete? Particularly as we've all kind of talked about the ways in which, both in this conversation, but in our personal research and our personal organizing, that the rights of the law don't attach to us, that don't attach to Black people. And oftentimes they become a precursor, right, to violations, right, of the Black body, of the Black psyche, of the Black spirit, as Michelle would say over here. And so I'm wondering, how do we think about that? Is the law itself obsolete? Is racism endemic? And if it is, what do we do? And I think that Saidiya Hartman gives us this notion when she's talking about fugitivity, particularly the fugitive stream, and in her new piece, this idea of, living otherwise, right? This idea that actually you maybe don't occupy space. Maybe you move freely. Maybe citizenship is not the goal. But what does that leave for us, right, in this moment of every day? I think that it's Dean Alexandra's talking about this kind of Black everyday. How do you live, right? If the law is obsolete, if racism is endemic. I mean, we're talking to a group of folks right now that are paying all this money to be in law school, but also understanding that the law itself has white supremacy embedded within it. How do we toil in this space, one, without going crazy, but two, but also leaving or creating a world for the children that come next, right? But also for those people that are living with us, the people that are dead, right, living and defending the dead, but the folks that are also dying in this moment. How do we create this universe? It can't be.
I think part of that answer to that goes back to, I think what you kind of underscore in, I think it's the article on strict scrutiny, the importance of witness and testimony as a precursor to action. And I would add along with that a kind of sort of understanding and putting into use of technology to those ends. And I'm thinking of the kind of moments of not just crisis, but possibility over the last, kind of 75 years or so. And I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter and culminating in, kind of the activism around George Floyd's murder. But starting perhaps with Trayvon Martin's murder. So that moment, I'm thinking about Rodney King moment and also the civil rights movement, and the ways in which in each of those moments, Black folks and fellow travelers were able to kind of capitalize on new technologies of, witnessing and communication and projecting their interpretation of what happened and what needs to happen, right? So we have, kind of the way in which both the pandemic and the way we were using social media has helped to sort of focus a kind of conversation where our voices are actually, kind of finding each other and theorizing with one another over the meaning of these events and how to kind of respond to them. In the same way that the civil rights movement, kind of commandeered the power of the television in order to kind of project and dramatize kind of what was happening in the Jim Crow South, and to kind of push for different kinds of change. The ways in which, the video recording of Rodney King's beating allowed for the space for a kind of conversation about, what policing has meant historically for Black people, right? And so I think these media and our use of these media have given us an opportunity to do something really, I think, important in the history of the West. And that's to kind of articulate what capitalism, what democracy, what America looks like from the vantage point of Black folks who have been commoditized, relegated to second-class citizenship, raped, lynched, so on and so forth. I think it's interesting when sort of describing and critiquing capitalism, Karl Marx starts with the commodity and spins out his description of the system from there, but he actually can't really picture what a commodity would say if a commodity were to speak, right? It's just this hypothetical, if a commodity were to speak, it would probably say some really grotesque things, right? But of course, we as Black folks know, kind of what it sounds like. We know what that testimony, elicits, what it means to be a speaking commodity and what the commodity might say, what kind of accounts the commodity would give of, these, kind of political and legal and social and economic processes across time. And what freedom looks like from our perspective, too, which is different, what the human looks like from our perspective, which is configured differently from liberal conceptions of humanity, liberal conceptions of, kind of, the sort of freedom. So I think, it seems like we're in crisis, and we are in crisis. I don't want to undermine that, but I think to the extent to which we've been able to kind of commandeer, these sort of media and technology to kind of give voice to our witnessing and to tell our stories and to theorize about our stories, from our stories about, kind of, what our experience says about the law, about politics, about the economy, is an interesting development. I mean, it's a generative space, potentially, full of potential, but also, kind of under threat as well. We see all the, the powers that be are kind of moving to, to close down all these spaces where that kind of thought is happening.
Mm-hmm. The Elon Muskification of information. Etienne,
right.
I love that framing, Dr. Thompson, especially the importance of stories. You asked Dr. Wilson whether law is obsolete, and I would push back against that question and suggest that the correct question would be, is law true? right? I think underlying that question is what is law? And there's a temptation to think about law as something that exists separate from society, right? This is, in fact, why the law in society in part was birthed, to sort of push back against that functionalist conception of law, which is to say society exists and then law is deployed in an instrumental way by lawyers and politicians to act upon society in ways that promote a conception of the common good, right? But that implicitly presumes that the constitution of the society is itself inherently good and has a normative dimension that all members of the society sort of agree to, and it accords with their individual conceptions of how they desire to organize themselves. And so this notion that the law exists outside of society obscures the extent to which law can in fact constitute the society itself, which is what we've seen across US history. And I think secondly, the idea of what law is sort of tugs at the question of what constitutionalism is, which is this broader debate that we're also having today as well, right? Is the Constitution the people, right? I mean, this is in fact the very first debate we had as a country with the American Revolution, except we had that debate with the British Crown, which is, at that time, the question was, is the Constitution Parliament? And the laws that flow from Parliament, and therefore we should subject ourselves as subjects of the king to taxes? Or is the Constitution the people? And the people deserve to have representation, therefore, before in the midst of political discourse, and therefore when the people are not represented, we reserve the right to revolt, right, in the form of the American Revolution. And so the question of what constitution means, whether it's an originalist idea of principles that come down from a natural conception of law, or whether it's a living conception of the people themselves and how they re-articulate human being as their conception of society evolves, is an ongoing debate. But therein lies the root of critical legal studies and critical race theory, which is to challenge us to think about the normalization of a society where we find ourselves living within, and how law constitutes that. So I think the question is not whether law is obsolete, because law is very much alive within us, right? If we believe that we are the law, so to speak. But the question is, do our lived experiences accord with what the law says about us, which is the law true? And us speaking our truth is therefore a protest to the extent to which the law does not reflect our lived experience, or the law is, in other words, telling us a lie about who we are, and therefore sort of putting us in a moment of crisis where our being contradicts what the law says we are, right? We experience ourselves as being human, but the law tells us that we are less than human, and that tension, that discord, that conflict creates the crisis, right? Requires the protest, requires the dissent, requires the reform. And so to me, I think that's the fundamental question.
I love a reframing. Jamilah, what you got?
All right, I had to take myself off of mute there. Yeah, I like that reframing. I want to go back and speak to some of what Dr. Thompson was saying with regard to technology. And I thought it was great, interesting that she reminded us of Rodney King, because one of the things I focused on is the ubiquity of cell phone video as witness. And she spoke of witness and testimony. And we see in the instance of the murder of George Floyd, with a child as our witness who otherwise would not have been believed, right? So we have this child witnessing using technology in a way that only our babies know how to use it anyway. And we can put that next to the Rodney King video, which was clear to Black folk looking at it and somehow unclear to white folk looking at it. Now we have this point of clarity where we're able, where Black folk and allies are able to use this technology. And what you then have is this backlash. So this idea, when you ask this question about law and whether it's obsolete, what I do know is that law is continuously used as a bludgeon. So here where we have the technology having advanced to the point that it is unquestionable what happened, well, now the backlash that is conceived of is one that would criminalize those who take video, that would criminalize witnessing. There's also a legal attack on memory and oral history as witness. So again, there's this criminalization of memory. We can see that in the ways in which there's been attacks on the teaching of history. We can see it in the AP Black History question in Florida, and all of this is couched in this fetishization of the idea of America. You can think of that John Locke quote, "In the beginning, all the world was America." Well, no, that's his using that wording "in the beginning," trying to give us this Genesis flashback. Is that in the beginning, the way that the beginning is conceptualized by the law and the whiteness of law is that the world is for the taking if you are white. And if you are white and male, and property, right? And so the world is for your taking. Everything else that came before or comes after doesn't matter, doesn't exist, that these are the line drawers. And when that is threatened in any way, then we can use the law as a bludgeon to put everything back in place. So whether that is criminalizing memory and history or criminalizing witness through video, the idea is that that the law has been used to reorder when there is disorder, and that disorder is decided by the hierarchies of white supremacy. So we see that coming forth in this idea of technology and even technological advances. That those advances have to be reordered so that they can be useful to white supremacy rather than a challenge to it.
One thing I like about what you just said before we go to Dean Alexander is this notion, right, of like, and Dr. Thompson too, right? So you use technology and you're doing these things that are either liberatory or make your life easier as a Black person. But as soon as you do that, the law, it catches up and turns it on its head. So there's this idea that there's this kind of grasping of a particular type of freedom or an emancipatory moment for a breath of fresh air, and then the air is poisoned, right? And now the air becomes a thing that kills you. So now you must learn how to breathe differently, or now you must learn how to breathe underwater. So there's always this in between of living and dying. Right? This kind of, I don't even want to say cat and mouse, because oftentimes we're the mouse and the mouse outsmarting the cat. This dance, right, that you're kind of identifying with technology in this area that's happening between Black folks and the law. Go ahead, Dean. What you got for me?
Well, yeah, so thank you. We wrapped it up in a bow. The law is not supposed to save you. The law is designed to kill you because it protects those in power. If you and the question you raised that triggered this wonderful discussion was, how do you survive in a world like that, right? How do you, as a Black person, understand the cycle and still like want to get out of bed, still like maintains, you can still maintain a purpose for living, etc. So the first thing, I think the crisis, especially for us who are students of the law, and I have gone through stages where I was quite enamored by the law. And I think I myself have to check how much do I deliver it as a gospel. is just the law is a tool, and it certainly is a very imperfect tool. And like the great Mos Def, as Blaze said, it won't save you. And if you are using it to do anything but to craft systems within the model, or maybe even think about overhauling and putting new laws, and then try to put gaps and stop gaps that could protect its co-option. If you're doing anything than that, or trying to make it a Shangri-La or a savior, you will just put yourself in a place where that's going to make you not just disgruntled or tired, but you will lose the will to live, because you are transposing a function that's supposed to come from inside of you into this external thing that's designed to enslave you, except for our own power to transcend these boundaries, for our own internal spiritual tools. So I put Howard Thurman in the chat, and not because I want to frame this in Christianity, but because I have found that the only solace that keep us moving is to go back to what the ancestors used to use, right? To go back to the roots of how we got over. And how we got over every time has been to harness our spiritual power, however we got there, and through the many traditions. And we do that from all corners of the globe. And we imagine a world where all of those things don't matter. We create new languages, we create new systems, we do things, we create whole industries that then they want. And then what does that mean then to formulate laws and systems that can stay ahead of those rapacious tendencies and give something to our babies, because you asked about the babies, and give something to our babies that they can carry over. And we are asking those same questions right this very minute because we're tired, right? But within that exhaustion, we and the ancestors and the things we inherit has brought us this far. And I think we're all having a spiritual crisis. What do we create now, especially for the Gen Xers? I know y'all like to pick on us. The Gen Xers are asking ourselves, right? How do we take this and create something new that we can leave behind? Because the struggle will continue. Because you will all of generations coming have to carry something and create something new from what we leave you. And we are just not sure yet that we can outsmart long enough to give you what you need so that you continue to outsmarting. I want and I hope one day that we won't have to do this cat and mouse game. But I truly believe that we have inherited in this reality, and it's not the only reality or dimension if you believe all of the things that are in space, but in this reality, we have inherited a very cyclical legal structure that is the current world order. But we are free human people that are here at this moment for a reason. We in this dynamic of evolution did not have to be here, but we happen to have inherited from a great source, a great tradition, the Black tradition that have given us life. So we have this life for a purpose. And that's why Howard Thurman and the civil rights leaders that went deeper than what they were seeing and looked at the composition of the human spirit so that we could teach children how to not be defined by rules that are external or by legal structure that are external. That's why I think it's so essential when you're asking that question, what do we do now? What do we do now? We go back to our traditions. We go back to the spiritual, even when you don't believe in God. You go back to what we do when we throw the water outside and say, I'm gonna protect me today. You go back to that, whatever give you your sense of freedom. And then you start teaching. You teach them and the kids what is not being taught in these books. And then you start creating new pathways, including dismantling myths about what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a man, etc.
I'm just gonna say, Michelle, you're really, quoting my other spiritual mother, Janet Jackson, as she says in her interlude. I was at the concert last weekend in Birmingham, had a splurge on VIP tickets. But she said, in the interlude of the Janet album, that first you have to learn how to water your own spiritual garden before you do any social justice work, right? So this idea of tending to and also protecting what that practice is, because it's not always one that can happen in public. Sometimes it's something you have to do on your own, so therefore it's not depleted. So thank you for bringing the spirituality and also giving me an excuse to mention Miss Demita Joe. Dr. Thompson.
Oh, Yeah, I want to go back to that question raised by Dr. Toussaint. This question of, is the law true, and pose it in a slightly different way. Whose truth does the law reflect? As a means of thinking through this sort of question about where do we go from here, right? So if I'm right that, the kind of afterlives of slavery and mastery kind of ended up giving conveying power to the white mob, police force, the state, to compel Blacks to, be put in their place, and the corporation to be able to continue to accumulate wealth on their own terms, on good terms, favorable terms to them. We can see that the way that these financial interests, kind of worked out their truth in the law right after emancipation by compelling Black folks to labor, to go back to sort of, indebted servitude, right? I think in our current time, what the corporations are compelling of not just Black folks, but other populations deemed surplus, is to go somewhere and quietly die. And, they want to diminish this sort of surplus population that's a result of deindustrialization and, kind of the way that sort of work has been, kind of rendered obsolete by technology and so on and so forth. So this question of, sort of the law not serving the interests of a widening surplus population, but it serves the truths and interests of financial interests who don't have a use for most people anymore. And so we find ourselves now in the predicament of living under these laws that an increasing number of people can't really sign on to. I mean, we're confronted with this sort of impasse whereby, for example, the gun laws, we have the imposition of these gun laws, an inability to kind of push through gun regulation against the will of something like 80% of the people who count as people, as sort of participants in democracy, right? And so the question I think we're presented with at this point is, now sort of empowered with that recognition that the laws are serving fewer and fewer people. I mean, not to mention the anti-abortion laws that, kind of write off the interests of half the population and the rights of half the population to their bodily integrity, right? How do people then mobilize to assert themselves as, kind of interested parties in the writing and, the enacting and the enforcing of law? I do think we're at a kind of crisis point in the way that surplus populations have been constituted and managed, whereby now we're talking about a surplus that is, kind of at a tipping point.
So I want to find a way to try to, sitting with a lot from these contributions, and wanted to find a way to think about, well, first, let me back up and say, I am not a lawyer, so I have very little to add to the conversation about whether or not the law is obsolete. I will submit my intellectual humility in that way and say that I don't think I can contribute to that conversation in a robust way. What I can say about this question about what can we do now? I love Sister Jamilah, Professor Jefferson Jones, bringing in the legacy of Darnella Frazier, the young woman who video recorded George Floyd, because it actually is an example of exactly what we could do now, and not what we can do now as in we can take videos, but why Darnella Frazier's legacy is important is that it teaches us that when we allow or when we see injustice through the eyes of Black women, for instance, we can't look away. When we see injustice through the lives of the most marginalized among us, there's something about that experience that we can't look away from. And if we want to know what we need to do now, we need to actually simply center the experiences, for instance, of queer Black people who have, for their entire existence, particularly queer trans folk, always already known what it feels like to be outside of the law, to have a body that has been rendered legally, culturally, spiritually, and religiously abject and criminal. And in spite of that, have this long and rich tradition of producing culture and producing communities. That's the first thing we could do. The second thing I wanted to pivot to with this question is part of, I think, the miracle of Black existence, both historically and contemporarily, is that we have a legacy of not confusing the current state of our laws or the current state of our lives with the state of our livelihood. That there is a difference when we talk about the current state of Black life versus, for instance, the current state of Black livelihood. So when we talk about the current state of Black life, I mean, from an empirical perspective, to speak of the current state of Black life requires us to return to the words of James Arthur Baldwin, who told us famously so many years ago that to be a Negro in this country is to be in a constant state of rage. We know that we have much to be enraged about. From the public health perspective, Black life expectancy is still significantly behind white life expectancy. From the educational perspective, we know that our schools are under-resourced and over-policed. I mean, we could go down the list. From the Black economic life continues to be in peril. And yet, what I'm getting at, and yet, part of what this moment shows us is that we are more than, we can't use that as the narrative for telling the story of our lives and the state of our communities, right? That right now, one of the things that I think is so exciting about this moment and how it gets back to this question of what we do now is, over the course of the past 10 years, when you look at the realm, we are so alive in so many places, right? We are alive in the space of Black political organizing. This moment that we're in and that we've been in for the past 10 years is probably the most active moment in terms of grassroots Black political mobilization that we've seen in Black communities since the Civil Rights era. We are alive there. We have to keep going there. And then finally, in terms of what we do, how do we respond? Question of technology. When we look at the explosion of the Black creative arts in the past decade, that's something that I also don't want us to miss, because there's that rich and long tradition there that for the past decade, everything from sort of the politicized music of Kendrick Lamar and Beyonce Knowles, the woke Black cinema of Ava DuVernay and Barry Jenkins, the content creators Issa Rae, Quinta Brunson, we see this reemergence in this moment of Black popular culture and creative expression as sites of Black political critique. And that's part of what we do now. In terms of technology, when we talk about technology, not just simply media technology, but how Toni Morrison envisions, what Foucault would call a technology of the self. What are the technologies of the self that we are creating in our community? It goes back to that Baby Silk's sermon in The Clearing in Beloved, right? What are the ways in which we are touching each other and loving each other and affirming each other and creating each other? That's what we do now, and that's also what we've always done.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. No, I mean, I just to echo Dr. Roberts, I'm not a lawyer. I also am not a professor, right? I am a community activist, a Black person in the world. And when I think about, is the law obsolete? I also think about it from the human rights perspective. And, from even like long ago, sociologists talking about like the state, a strong state is supposed to have a monopoly on the means of violence, not life, not prosperity, not, soul giving, not even human rights, but a monopoly on the violence that is in a territory. And with the logics of white supremacy so tightly woven into the law, and the law justifying the state, that we live in, the country, the US, right? How is it that then also the logic of the state is tightly woven into white violence? And then like we see the state deploying this white violence strategically into keeping, white opportunities, white property value, whiteness, into keeping whiteness together. And so, I see folks now taking the justice, right, into their hands. They don't believe in the law. So, I mean, let's be honest, nobody wants to call the cops anymore. Like, and it is what it is. Although Black folks do be calling the cops, right? It's always a hesitation. Are you going to trust this institution that we call policing? Are you going to trust this institution that we call the, criminal justice system? People in my community right now, the folks that I talk with, they don't even call it the criminal justice system anymore. They call it the criminal legal system, right? They said, do not affiliate justice with what that is, what that institution is. And so you see folks who are taking justice into their own hands, who are trying to create avenues of justice for themselves. And, we might not always like it because sometimes it does look like community violence. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it looks like restorative justice. Sometimes it looks like taking folks into the church basement, being in a circle and saying, we're going to hash this out right now. There's a community in Miami, right? A real strong Black, middle-class community. One day, one of the elders, they were mugged, they got their Rolex taken from them, right? And they said, we not gonna have this, okay? And within a week, that elder, he got an apology and his Rolex back. No police, no justice system involved. But, that's the question is now y'all, I'm assuming I can't see everybody who's in the audience, right? But y'all are lawyers. At some point, we have to realize that people matter beyond the law. People matter beyond these institutions, but the forms of creating justice, of creating an institution that, somehow does bring truth to what and Dr. Toussaint was saying earlier, truth to our existence, and institutionalizing that as a form of, okay, we can agree on this and we can get together and move together on this institutionalized law, right? It doesn't have to be what the law is now, but how can we build up our muscles for that? How can we practice that type of justice building, that type of sustainability building within our community? And that's, what y'all lawyers have to do. Like, that's exactly what I want to do beyond this law. I mean, I don't think that America is going to last very long. I might be a pessimist on this, right? Like, American democracy is in its downfall era and its flop era. But there's going to be people beyond America. So what tools do we need to build something better after this?
Yeah, I'm going to come to Professor Toussaint in a moment, but I just want to address something that both Angela and Dr. Roberts noted. You're not lawyers, but it also does not mean, right, that you don't have an expertise in law. I like to think about law as the kind of public logic of power and the private practice of that logic. And so if we think about it like that, I would believe that Black non-lawyers are probably the greatest experts on the ways in which law orders and disorders are living and dying, but also the ways in which, like, written law, Black letter law, but also law is practiced by police officers, by prosecutors, but also by your mama and daddy, right? We become an expert in that every day because we're still alive. Right. So that shows a level of mastery that I think that Dr. Thompson was talking about. Before I go to Professor Toussaint and Dr. Roberts, so I also want to undergird and kind of get back to this point that Angela is talking about. What does it mean really to kind of have this kind of sustaining practice for Black folks and also for all people? For me, what I do, and I'm trying to think about, like, what does it mean to be a Black person, teaching people about an anti-Black law, but also trying to get them to pass the bar exam and be great at whatever it is that they're going to be doing, whether it's a prosecutor, me being an abolitionist, defense attorney, or if they're going to be a community organizer or a scholar. And what I've done for myself is try to think about the law, really think about justice through the eyes of the first enslaved people that came over here on musty ships. Right? What would justice look like through their eyes? Because right now, when we think about the law, we think about it through the eyes of the founding rapist, genocidal, slave-owning founders, right? But we don't think about it through the folks that their lives were made possible through, right? We don't think about the 600 people that Thomas Jefferson owned, right? So how does that shift us, right? And then so what practices do each of you, and of course answer this as the other questions as you want, Professor Toussaint and Dr. Roberts, but I'm wondering what practices you might advise each of us, whether we're talking about our law students, whether we're talking about parents, whether we're talking about being queer folk, non-binary, trans, Black women, whatever in America, what practices do we need to be able to be human in the jobs that we do? To be human in the day-to-day while we're under, right, this particular paradigm of an anti-Black climate. right? So what do we do there? Knowing that the law is anti-Black, knowing that whatever profession you're in has anti-Black dimensions, how do we, as I think that Dean Alexandra said in the Old Gospel kind of quote, how do you get over? Or at least how do you get through if you never get over?
I love the question. I love the framing. To me, the simple answer is that we reckon. And I think the process of reckoning is an ongoing process. I think it's something that Black lives and other marginalized populations have been doing since, the first European imperialists landed on this shore. I love the way James Baldwin puts it in The Price of the Ticket, when he's sort of urging white America to think about what reckoning means for them. And he sort of says the deeper question is whether white America is willing to pay the price of Black liberation. And he describes it as, quote, the price a white woman, man, boy, and girl will have to pay in themselves before they can look on me as another human being. So this, end quote. So this kind of connects back to this conversation we were having in the beginning, where part of it is reckoning with what it means to be human, what it means to be a citizen, and thinking about how the law reflects that lived experience and the ways that experience inhibits a fully integrated lived experience for others. And so, but there's also an extent to which Black folks have also been reckoning, and I'll also highlight an essay, one of my favorite essays of Baldwin, called The Expression of the Blues. And in that essay, he quotes a line from Bessie Smith that I'll just read. I think it's profound. It says, "Ma and Pa got drowned. Mississippi, you the blame. My ma and Pa got drowned. Mississippi, you the blame. Mississippi River, I can't stand to hear your name." And I just love that, because I think what Baldwin is trying to say is there's something powerful in embracing pain, but also sort of coming to terms with pain and allowing it to be a moment of joy. And to me, that's part of the Black radical tradition too, right? That's part of the creation of jazz, the creation of blues, the creation of hip hop, a sense that, and Baldwin calls this a passionate detachment, but a sense that reckoning is coming to terms with what is, while also finding joy in what can be, right? Coming to terms with the pain of knowing that this body of water that we've called Mississippi River is a place of pain and blood and tears where your ancestors died, and that might be connected to racial terrorism and what have you, but it also is a space where you can reckon and think about what can be and find joy in embracing the notion that is also a space of love, right? What I love about Morrison, which we mentioned earlier, is that in the midst of reckoning with the pain of the beloved, she's also implicitly calling us to be loved, right? The sort of the double meaning of the title itself, right? And so I think for Black folks in particular, that's been a long tradition, and finding a way to find the love as we come together in spirit, so to speak, to sort of allude to what Dean Alexander said, but yet continuing to push America more generally to reckon with the truth of where we are and what we are, and how that causes us to fall short of who we could really be.
So just echoing on that, first of all, of course, I love when Baldwin enters the conversation. I hope he stays here forever, time and again. To the earlier point about very graciously saying that there is a place for non-lawyers to have a conversation. One of the things that I often say when I'm in conversation with my policymaking friends and in the policymaking spaces that I've found myself in over the course of my career is reminding both legal scholars, lawyers, and sort of policy folk, let's call them, is that the law will not save us, and that we're not going to sort of legislate racism away, which I think is very important in terms of from a pedagogical perspective for those of us who are teachers and who are teaching our students how to engage the law and how to engage discourses in relationship to the world, making sure that people remember that having a sort of, having this fidelity or almost, what would the word be? I'm drawing a blank here, but having a sort of sacrilegious attachment, or idolatrous is rather the word, attachment to the law as the site of our liberation is a doomsday project to begin with. So sort of reminding we're not going to legislate racism away. We have to deal with these deeper existential questions. But to the second question about how do we respond then? I mean, one of the ways I've responded in my own sort of journey is that I describe myself, first and foremost, as a grassroots political organizer strategically located in the academy as a scholar activist. And I've taken my cue from the poet philosopher Fred Moten, who I had the pleasure of studying with as my dissertation director, who says it best when he says that, the goal of the Black radical intellectual is to be in the academy, but not of it. And that the actual, the sort of goal or the vocational call of the Black radical intellectual, lawyer, XYZ, is to be a kind of thief, right? And that our job is to actually steal the resources of the academy and of the institutions that we are in and give them back to the people, right? And so this idea of being a kind of the Black radical intellectual as cultural thief or resource thief is something that I'm very interested in and I think is necessary. I mean, we think about Black studies itself as a kind of fugitive project, as a kind of criminal project that is very much invested in being in the academy, but outside of it. And that's one of the ways we reconcile this age-old tension for those of us who are who are thinking through the violence of the very systems which we find ourselves situated within. It means, what does it mean to strategically steal and take away and be intellectual thieves and to give back to the people in the spirit of what Moten refers to as the sort of maroon project of the undercommons? For me, that's important.
I just want to add on to that before I go to Dr. Thompson. I mean, when you're talking about this idea of the role, right, of the kind of Black radical intellectual in the academy, the idea to be the thief, to bring these kind of resources back home, right, I think is something that is really useful for lawyers in particular. Charles Hamilton Houston says it differently. He says a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. But I also like this idea of being embedded in spaces, right, to bring resources back home. And I think that for my students that have been asking me that are trying to be public defenders or even prosecutors or working at firms, that is the role, right? When you're taking cases, when you're at this institution, what are you bringing home, right? It isn't just about who signs your checks, but the question is like, what type of reparatory work, are you doing? So I just wanted to underscore that. So thank you for bringing that back, because I think that oftentimes, to the point I was making earlier, folks don't think they can give advice to lawyers. But lawyers are called counselors, but oftentimes they're the ones that need to sit back and listen a little bit because there's more humanity elsewhere often. Dr. Thompson.
Yes, I want to thank Dr. Roberts for bringing Moten's notion of the undercommons into the conversation, especially in relationship to Black studies, because that encapsulates what I feel like my role is in sort of helping to sort of create and perpetuate institutions in which this, kind of freedom work might be done. But I think one of the issues, the challenges that I've been contending with as someone who's helped to create and administer a Black Studies department here in the belly of the beast of the State University, in Texas, is to keep. It's forced me to keep track of the ways in which I become a kind of instrument of that power of the institution of the university, as well as someone who can sort of, commandeer resources and divert them to, the folks who are doing this sort of life-affirming work for Black people. I also represent the power of the institution in really, kind of impactful ways that I have to keep track of and mitigate against in my dealings with people, be they my students, colleagues, or members of the public who we, kind of invite onto campus and kind of give space to in sort of talking about all of these other issues that impact our communities. So that's one thing, sort of one of the ways I sort of see myself now is not having, gotten over or, not moving through the institution, but inhabiting the institution and mitigating against the way its, kind of nefarious tendencies impact people who are not, kind of in the position that I am within it. The other thing I do is teach. And through teaching and writing, continually kind of reaffirm that my main obligations are to those who I call my ancestors, right? I'm a kind of caretaker of their legacy. And so when I'm teaching Douglas or Jacobs or, kind of, having students kind of read their words or even sort of going to the archives and kind of uncovering moments of Black witnessing. I try to be really careful about how I present, interpret, and sort of highlight and contextualize the testimony of my collective ancestors. And so that's, as a historian, that's how I kind of see my role.
Again, to your question on, what to do, how to work and move within, community, I feel like, we have to, on multiple levels, right? We have to be careful about our avenues of joy that we walk down, because joy from a capitalist exploitation is hollow, right? Our cell phones and our laptops, TikTok might be fun, but, it comes from exploited labor, environmental degradation of the Congo, what really brings me a lot of joy, right? Understanding how our world and our systems have been shaped in a white supremacist, heteronormative, framework, right? Like the state has a vested interest in mapping onto our bodies a heteronormativity and, an idea of whiteness and respectability, right? What brings me a lot of joy is kind of breaking, sometimes like pushing up against the boundaries like that with my community, right? Like, there's a joy of being in the community, of talking to people, of having conversations like this, that I feel is just so much deeper, so much, more life affirming and life giving, and being in the practice of a Black joy that, is not on fast fashion, but on seeing people and talking to real people and being humble, and the practice of humility. And I say humble in the sense of like not thinking less of yourself, but thinking more about the community and the people around you. And being in a practice of kindness and allowing folks to really just express themselves. I woke up one day and I decided, what does it look like, to not really be bound fully by the ideals of respectability politics, of womanhood that my mama gave me. Like, what would that look like? And it looked like me shopping in the men's section and having fun. Like, I be having fun out here. What does it look like to stop straightening my hair and locking it up and understanding, yeah, my locks ain't that cute, but they cute to me, right? And practicing that type of love and joy for other people as they are also expressing themselves, as they are also going through these journeys, and holding that together while we're also navigating these ideas of justice, of a new life, of born out of something new. We got to practice it within ourselves first, to then also practice it as a new living of our community.
I just wanted to, can I jump back in?
Go and jump up in there.
Really quick response. I wanted to say, I'm so glad that Dr. Thompson did mention teaching, because I wanted to say something about that, which is, I think, often gets left out in these conversations. And I come out of a tradition where, for me, teaching really is a form of community organizing. And I think we need to lean into that a little bit more. Also, these conversations, there is a part of us that I think many of us feel like, oh my gosh, another panel conversation. I was joking via email with Dr. Anansi about the fact that I am in Denver, Colorado right now for another event with another panel that's going to happen right after this, and that I might have been tired this morning because I'm getting ready for the next panel, and that over the course of the past 2 years, I probably sat on more, and this is true for I'm sure all of us, probably been on more panels in the past 5 years than we've been in the past 30 prior to that. But there's actually something about that that's useful, and that what we also see happening over the course of the rise of the movement for Black lives is that we are beginning again to lean into the importance of deep communal dialogue and deep Black study, which is what I wanted to end with saying to the sort of emergent Black legal scholars and lawyers in the making and scholars in the making. You know, one of the things about the Black radical tradition that is so important is that it is a tradition founded on the assumption that there is a foundational relationship between Black liberation and intellectual inquiry, which is to say the historical relationship between Black struggle and Black study. So when we look at all of the sort of major organizers in the Black radical tradition, whether it's Malcolm or Martin or Fannie Lou or Audre Lorde or Bayard Rustin, part of what made these people great organizers is that they were first deeply committed to the life of the mind. So it was, you know, MLK's philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience, sometimes we forget, was really based on his deep intellectual engagement with the work of Gandhi. The Black Panther Party's slogan of power to the people is deeply informed by their readings of Karl Marx. We could go down the list. And so this idea that the role of emergent Black legal scholars, Black thinkers, is to continue this tradition of understanding that there is a relationship between deep Black struggle and deep Black study.
Dr. Roberts, you're right on time because there's a question about Dr. King, and and I think you just kind of explained some. You know, we're in Chicago, y'all. It's very noisy. I'm back in a big city and it's nothing but noise. So Dr. Roberts was just touching on something important, which is that when we are influenced by the precursors, the ancestors, we need to look at what influenced them and what they studied. And you mentioned, you know, influence of Gandhi, and you know, I mentioned earlier Dr. King. You know, the canon, when you are teaching, as Dr. Thompson was talking about, it's not about what isn't being interpreted in the outside. It's really to go deep into how they kept growing, right? How they struggled and wrestled with those questions that we're wrestling with, but they seem to have kind of, you know, from our perspective, before we go and understand what they committed to every day to expanding, that they seem to grow larger than life. And I think that Dr. Roberts, your key call to really understand the role of teaching. For me, to answer your question, that last question, teaching, living, writing, and loving. Those are the way we go from here, and it's not easy. You know, I want to lift up Myers, Angela Myers, when you were talking about your own experience. It's not easy at all. But you know, connecting everything that's been said, everyone who's contributed, and we are now called to do the same. You have to struggle with that, because the experience of living is not easy. The experience of being a human person is not easy. And for me, I started this journey by just not being comfortable with everyday restrictions on my body. Yes. That was just the basic side of it. From a child, I could not compute, right, the constraints. And so my first article talked about dance halls, masquerades, and body protests, the way in which the body itself is a tool of revolution. Because my people in Haiti use the body, the Caribbean, the Africa, everything in not just private revolution, but state, right, and legal revolution. But loving and living and writing, I think you grow into, and particularly the loving. You can't do anything without love. But you gotta love yourself first. And so as my writing evolved and asked those questions and went back to the roots, then the liberation of my own body took place, so that those restrictions, instead of bothering me or becoming a thing that I wanted to protest, they became my liberation. Because I realized I could walk into the room and create my own room. I could shop in the men's, and they make real good clothes for men. And I do not like most of the women clothes, although I can use them. And I don't consider myself a man or woman. I'm somewhere in between with no words for it. But I couldn't have gone there without questioning those restrictions. I couldn't have gone there, more importantly, without figuring out what it means to love. Because I can't love my child without loving myself, without restriction. And I can't love my people without loving myself, without restrictions. And then so that opens this whole new world where we are now writing, right, and creating this legacy that we hope other people, based on the wisdom of life and what we have gained from others, other people will benefit from. And I think you all are doing this work so importantly, so that one day, 50, 100 years from now, they understand what we struggled with, what we stood in to be free and be a full people. And then the definition of what it is to be a human person will be completely evolved. I really truly believe that. But every inch of it is very difficult. Every inch of it is painful. That's why I love that Black joy came in, because the joy of belonging to yourself really gets you through. And then you manifest the joy of everything, including how we dance and laugh and, and just.
I love this. I love this because, like, what I'm thinking of too, and it's so funny that, I'm not Christian at all, but we keep coming back to some of these motifs, which, I mean, we already know that this is infused with the religious practice of the enslaved, right? That predates Christianity in a lot of ways. But I keep thinking about, this notion of joy, and I'm gonna make a comment, and I'm gonna give us the last questions I want us to, and close to on time, I know you folks have a lot of panels to do, but this idea of joy, but also this notion that joy coming in the morning, right? Not just at the rising of the sun, but in the morning, possibly, of that person we were before. I think to Angela's point, right, when you're dealing with the inheritance of your mother, the inheritance of who your father wants you to be, the inheritance of who the nation says you or your people are, there's a morning in the freedom making, right? And for me, it's really interesting. I think about this idea of, like, what does it mean to kind of be Black queer, but also be non-binary, sit in the space? When I was in law school at Howard, I always struggled with this notion of, like, there's the Howard man, and how the hair is supposed to be. And I had this big old fro, and I had these blonde locks. I was doing the most as I'm doing now, right? What kind of law professor looks like this? But what I would do to kind of sustain myself is at night, and I hope I never get caught doing this again, I would jump over the fence at Frederick Douglass's house in Anacostia. And I would go sit on this rocking chair in the front porch, and I would write about what type of person I wanted to be. And I would also reflect on their writings. And, that place was so spiritual for me, because that's also where Frederick Douglass died, right there in that doorway, on the way to give a speech for women's liberation, right? So the idea that he had a heart attack, his last breath was on the way to do the work when he had already been out of slavery, up from slavery, didn't have to do nothing else, right? And so I think about, like, what these types of pedagogies are, not just the pedagogy of how do I teach my students. And my idea is, like Bell Hooks, education is the practice of freedom. It's the study of freedom. It's the way that one becomes free and also bequeaths freedom. But in another way, I want to think about the pedagogies of ancestry. Right? How are we in this moment teaching both ourselves to be free, but also how are we teaching ourselves how to learn to be free? And to, I think, Dean Alexandra's point, how is that being transmitted? Not just in our written word, but the way that we walk in a room. And I'll end with this and then go over to Dean Jones over here. I love that quote by, Maya Angelou that was given to Oprah, that when I walk into the room, I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. And I always ask myself, if those 10,000 see me right now, what would their judgment be? Right? And not in the lens of homophobia or heterosexism, what have you, but am I doing their name and their blood and their bones justice? Right? And is that justice just for us? Or is it one that is a liberatory spirit that even their wildest dreams could not imagine? And so I'm going to ask this final question, and Dean Jones, answer it how you want. But there was a question in the chat about, is America a democracy? And maybe you believe that, maybe you don't. But if not, how might it become one? And, you can use these also as your kind of closing thoughts. So take this question as you will.
So I'm not going to answer that question. I'll leave that for others. That's part of that senior scholar thing that you mentioned, is that I feel free to do as I please.
Yes.
And so I want to speak to that moment because I visualize you sitting on the porch in the rocking chair. But also I visualize this idea of Frederick Douglass dying in the work, which is beautiful in a way, but is also terrifying and terrible. And so I think it's important for us that as we work to remember that rest itself is radical and revolutionary. And it speaks to the idea that Dean Alexander was saying about love and self-love, that is also a part of it. And so I want to admonish us to remember to pause within the work, to rest, and to not allow it to kill us, because I'm hoping not to die in the work, even though others have, and others more, who are greater than me and have given more than me have. But yes, I believe in the NAP ministry and other types of rest. So I just wanted to put that out there, and that's my closing piece.
Shout out to the NAP ministry. We love that.
To your question, and also to who are you envisioning coming over, right? Like my ancestors also came over through the transatlantic slave trade. And I think of Oyewume's work on the invention of woman and how the construction of gender, right, reformulated and reconfigured Yoruba society and Nigerian society. And so when I think of my ancestor, who has been bought as chattel, right, and who has been their body used to justify a race caste, a racial science, right, in the US. Their body has been used, the just physicalness of the body has been used for the production of, cotton, sugarcane, whatever, what have you, but also for the production of a race science, of a structure of society. Right. And so I think of, on my ancestors, the work that I do in community is to make sure that I see people as human, not just for their bodies, not just for their gender expressions, not just for, what they've been through, what they can give to me, the prestige or success that anybody gives to me, I immediately refute if it is not based in the work that is just face to face with somebody. Right. And so I'm trying to make sure that Black people live. And we know so harsh how folks, they take their lives when you don't love on them, when you cannot see them for who they are, for a human being. And, that's exactly, I feel like, what we should continue to do. And although it's easy to say, it's hard to do. It is hard at, 2 p.m., right after my classes, right after I've just submitted a 40-page thing, when I get a call from somebody saying the police brutalized me and I need help right now. It is hard to see people, I work with a lot of mothers of the movement who lost sons to police brutality. It is hard to sit with them day after day, week after week, and hearing the stories. I mean, I cannot even imagine what it's like to go through, right? And it's hard just to listen and to hear, and then to ask and to see this person as a human being, that is the root of a movement, not just the saying, okay, I just did it because I needed to say for my own credibility that I work with these people. No, to actually say, what do we need? Okay, the UN, the United Nations expert mechanism on law enforcement and racism is coming to Minneapolis May 2nd, right? The question is, okay, they're coming, now what? What do you need? What do you want? How do you want to utilize this moment for political motivation so that nobody else dies, by the hands of police in Minneapolis? Just yesterday, somebody died by the hands of the FBI in Minneapolis, right? And so, these are the aspects I feel like are very intertwined, and just from living life and caring and loving folks to the actual action of doing the work. Because you cannot do the work if you do not see people that you are working with as people, right? If you see them as subjects, or if you see them as another crazy person out here saying that they got, their husband, their fiance was murdered by the police, but there's no evidence to it. There's no hard testimony. There's no cell phone camera. What does it mean to actually take that witness, that testimony, and believe that person wholeheartedly, even though they didn't say it the way you might have wanted them to say it, right? They might not themselves be in a stable, grounded place themselves, but to believe them, to honor their humanity, and to honor the humanity of the loved one they lost, and to just keep working on what do you need and what do you want, and to keep just hitting that over and over and over and over again.
Care work. Go ahead.
So I have a lawyer answer for you to your very interesting question about democracy, and then I have a Haitian American answer for you. The first, the lawyer answer is that it depends, right? It depends. When the United States was created, it was aspirational, and we all, I think, Professor Associate Dean Jefferson Jones said it absolutely right, that when it was created, there were aspirational notes in there, but we weren't living obviously up to it. But we all work. I think you put that in the chat. We all work because we believe in what it can be. There is an experiment here. and that's when I get enthralled, so I'm going to real manage that. There's an experiment here that was unique, and that there's a reason why Europe is so fascinated with the United States, and that we have so many parallels, like in South Africa and other places where it's flipped, because there's not a real place like the United States because of the results of bringing all of these bodies, right, these Black bodies, and created this country that was the product of the labor of Black bodies. So I think there's a lot of things and ways in which a democratic state can be created, as long as you don't make a religion out of either of them, right? But then the Haitian American answer becomes even more fascinated by this experiment, because what I inherited as a culture, at least when I was on the side of Haiti, is the story you hear about Toussaint. It was amazing, but the one that you may not hear about as much is Boukman. So Boukman is a precursor to Toussaint. At some point, he worked hand in hand, but he was in the mountains, and he was a spiritual leader that would gather thousands and thousands of people and do voodoo rituals in the woods. And the whole point was to really elevate the spirits of the resistors to slavery, so that they would be able to understand their power and then be able to fight. And Boukman was so powerful that they killed him. Like they put his head on a stake, and his legend was transferred to children everywhere in Haiti, because that's how Haitians do. So the power of Boukman and his legacy, and it's then the link to the creation of the state of Haiti and defying, right? So Americans are taught that if it wasn't for that envisioning of a state, true spiritual liberation, right, particularly African spiritual liberation, there would be no state. And then the question is, what is the state? And that's when, right, we didn't have the imagination or the resources at the time to imagine a state other than a duplication of Europeanness. So it didn't work out, right? It didn't work out as well as it could have worked out, because we are now plagued by debt and also infrastructure to which many have contributed. But my fascination is with the creation of the state, because at some point we all have to organize ourselves, and we all have to promulgate rules and share living and do communal living. And all of these entities are capable of it. The United States is capable of it. We can share resources. We can have new rules. And so the question to me is not whether the United States is a democracy, is whether our statehood has been created properly enough to encompass what we can be, and how can we change that?
Wonderful. Etienne and Dr. Roberts, some final thoughts from you?
Thank you. You left us with the quote, "I come as one, but stand as 10,000," and it left me thinking about my grandmother. who came to this country from a very small island, Dominica in the West Indies, in the midst of Jim Crow America, with no education, could not read. Her daughter, 1 year old, in her hand, and her husband. And I think she would answer the question and say, it doesn't matter what is, it matters what can be. Right? That even if America is not democracy, what matters is that America is becoming, or as Langston Hughes said, we're on a journey to let America be America again. And I think that too is part of the Black radical tradition, and focus on what can be. I mean, to be honest, but for that vision, right, Black America would have burned down the house a long time ago, and rightfully so. And so I believe that at root, democracy is about believing in a promise of what we can be, and not allowing the tragedy and savagery and barbarism of what is to overwhelm us with despair. And so I think there's much promise and much opportunity for law to evolve, and that gives me hope as a teacher, as a scholar, as Dr. Roberts said, a scholar activist, to try to remain enmeshed in community, but utilize this perch to impact, those and to honor those that came before me, to continue to move the ball forward.
Thank you for that story, Brother Toussaint. It's touching.
So Jose Esteban Munoz, just before he passed away, who was actually, suddenly this became a series of stories about former advisors. That was my advisor before Fred took the mantle, before he passed away. And he wrote a book just before he died, called Cruising Utopia, the then and there of queer futurity. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And I always love the way that book opens, where he says, quote, "Queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Queerness is not yet here, but at moments we can feel it as the warm illumination of the present." And I want to reframe that to think about it in relationship to democracy, and say the same thing, right? That democracy is not yet here. Democracy is an ideality. Democracy is not yet here, but at moments we can still feel it and access it as the warm illumination of the present. And I know that. I felt it when I was in Ferguson, that democracy was not yet here, but I could feel it on the way. I felt it when we were shutting down the West Side Highway in the aftermath of the Eric Garner, Daniel Pantaleo decision. It wasn't here yet, but I could feel it coming to us. I felt it when, like so many of us, we were out there in the streets in the aftermath of George Floyd. That democracy is always that thing that is not yet here, but keeps us mobilizing and moving and fighting towards that thing. And so I want us to kind of lean into that. For the legal folks, the law students in the room, there are a couple things to say. I mean, so part of why I came to the Academy and became a scholar activist, quite simply, to be honest, was that the Academy gave me a language to describe complex, and this is the story for so many Black people, right? It gave me a language to describe the evidence of my lived experience that I already knew, but didn't have the fancy vocabulary to describe beforehand. So long before I knew Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, I had the lived experience of being triply marked as a queer Black man. Long before I knew the language of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, I knew that it was odd that my mama and my daddy ended up in prison, incarcerated with decades-long sentences before they turned 30. Long before I had the language of structural inequality, I found it odd that all the students in my school were not going to four-year colleges, right? So part of what the Academy has done so often for so many of us is it gives us what Toni Morrison describes as a language to dwell in. And so part of what I love about what Dr. T is doing, what all of you are doing, is that they are giving us some language to dwell in. Furtive Blackness is some language for us to dwell in, y'all, right? And part of the call then for the law students in the room is that I hope you use this moment to get some language for us to dwell in. That another way of simply saying that is that our movements need you. Our movements need you. That very often we think of the academy as this place that is responding to social movements and that we're kind of armchair intellectuals. But the story of the Black radicals tradition in the United States is just the opposite, right? That where would we be if we didn't have Michelle Alexander's framework, which began in the academy, the idea of the new Jim Crow? Where would we be had it not been for a Black woman named Kimberly Williams Crenshaw who comes up with this legal theory of intersectionality? Where would we be if we didn't have Kathy Cohen at the University of Chicago create the Black Youth Project, which then goes on to do incredible work, BYP 100, right? And so I want you all to remember that our movements need you. I have a friend, Stephen Fullwood, who's a queer organizer who is the founder of the Black Gay and Lesbian Archive at the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture. And he said, yes, you know, Brother Stephen. Yes. And he also says that, wrap up the question in terms of how is it about the ancestors. He says, he said, remember, we are the new ancestors, act accordingly. He says, remember that there are people in the future looking for you. What breadcrumbs are you leaving behind? There are people in the future looking for you. What crumbs are you leaving behind? And so part of our work is to leave breadcrumbs, y'all, whether it be in the form of our essays, our books, the way we love each other, the way we show up for each other, the things that we do, the things that we don't. We are leaving breadcrumbs for the people in the future who are looking for us.
Whew. Stephen always got something good to say. I had to write that down. Thank you for that. Are there any other final thoughts before we wrap up? Anyone else? No?
That
All
was
right.
a word right there.
That was, I mean, my goodness, I'm scared to say goodbye now, but I'll just say it was really lovely having everyone here. And I'm really thankful that you all came out, both this panel, the folks that are in the audience, the first panel this morning, to help us all kind of think through and think about what does it mean, one, to live in the afterlives of slavery? How do we think through furtive Blackness? But more importantly, what does it mean to be a human being in this current moment now? Wherever you are, whatever you look like, what is your duty to yourself? What is your duty to the children that come next, those that came before you? And what are the possibilities for midwifing this thing that we call democracy? And finally, before we go, obviously thanking all the panelists and all the mentors and cousins and aunties and brothers and sisters on this panel with me, but also Devin for putting this together as our editor-in-chief. This will be recorded and we'll be sending out the link. So don't trip if you weren't able to write anything down. Devin, do you have anything final to say before we close out? All right, then that was the final word. Thank you all so much, and we'll hopefully be in touch soon.
Thank you, Dr. T, and everyone who organized.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
There it is.